Hey everybody, welcome back to the SuperBake podcast. I'm your host, Baker. Let's talk about stuff. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So this may be the last episode of the year. We'll just have to kind of see. Again, been kind of busy the last few weeks with work, the holidays, and everything else going on in my life, but we'll see. I think the beginning of the year, I'm definitely going to try to get back into more of a routine with weekly or bi-weekly podcast episodes. So we'll just have to wait and see. I did want to take this time to say that this marks the 2-year anniversary since this podcast first started. Technically it's a day late. I started this Christmas of 2021. 2 years running, still plan on keep going. So it's been awesome for sure. I've definitely enjoyed making this podcast, even though the last few months have been kind of difficult to keep up with everything. For those of you out there that have been supporting this podcast, I definitely appreciate it. And hopefully we continue to grow. Hopefully we continue to find, bigger audience. And hopefully there's people find stuff in here that they like to listen to. So I'm still going to keep making episodes. It's just, lately, it's just been a little bit more sporadic than I would have liked, but hopefully that's going to change here in the new year. But with this episode, I just want to take the time to talk about the last 2 episodes of Part 1 of Season 2 of Invincible. Reacher's doing the same thing. Like, they did the first 3 episodes for Season 2, and then the last episodes are supposed to come out, I think, in January. So I'll probably do a review of that show, too. I also want to do a review of the show, the anime series on Netflix called Pluto. I feel like it's an anime series that I haven't heard too many people talking about, so I'll probably do a review for that one too in the near future. But for now, episodes 3 and 4 of Invincible, Season 2. So we'll start with episode 3. This one I thought was interesting for a few reasons. I like how it bounces back and forth between 2 different narratives that I'll kind of get into here in a second. But we get to see Mark going off to college. We get to see more of his life in that regard, as well as how his mom is kind of coping with that too. There are a lot of scenes in this episode where we see Debbie kind of by herself, and we really get to see like the weight of everything and how it's affecting her, how she's trying to get on with her life and she's trying to get over what happened with her and Nolan and everything, but it's clear that she's still haunted by the events of what happened. And she meets a character in this episode that I'll kind of get into here shortly that really kind of makes it difficult for her to move on. As far as Mark's story goes, Mark's character in this episode definitely he's still kind of the focus, but really the focus in this episode is there's a lot of other stuff going on here too. Alan from season 1, voiced by Seth Rogen, gets a much bigger role in this one. In fact, that's actually one of the big changes in this episode that I liked how instead of the Invincible title card that they play at the beginning, it's actually Alan. And I really like that. I'd even like how they use the usual gag of, that guy is, and instead of saying Invincible, they actually play the title card. And this one they do the same thing, but with Alan, and then they play the Alan title card. So that part was funny. I like that we get to see more of Alan's character, him with the Coalition of Planets. We're also introduced to a pretty big character, I think, from the comics called Thaddeus, voiced by the legendary Peter Cullen. For those of you who don't know, that's the man that voiced Optimus Prime, both in the original Transformers cartoon and also in the live-action Michael Bay films. So hearing his voice in this show was really cool. Of course, I think I talked about that when I discussed the teaser trailer for Season 2. So I already kind of knew going into this that he was going to play a pretty big voice or part in this season, so it's still really cool hearing him actually speak, though. And also it's kind of cool to get to see more of the Coalition of Planets. We only really got to hear hints of them in season 1, so seeing like when Alan goes to talk to the council to tell them about Nolan's character leaving Earth and also informing them about Mark, it definitely feels like it's setting the stage for bigger events that are going to be coming down the line. And I also like how we get to see kind of Alan go to bat for Mark in this one. Like, he's kind of trying to defend him. Like, the council is kind of leery about Mark. They don't trust him because he's half Viltrumite, but Alan is kind of stepping up for Mark and speaking up for him. So I like that whole aspect. I thought that was a really nice scene with Alan's character. In general, I just really like Alan. He hasn't gotten a whole lot of screen time between seasons 1 and 2, but I think they still managed to do a lot with what little they do, or what little time he has in the show. This also leads to a relatively big moment between Alan's character and Thetis, where it turns out that Thetis thinks that there's some kind of mole within the coalition because it seems like every time they try to get a new planet to join them, the Viltrumites attack it. So they're all really paranoid that the Viltrumites may be spying on them. So that whole stuff with them is really interesting. We also get to see 3 new Viltrumites show up into the show as well. Can't remember their names off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look at them again. But that part, I like that we're getting to see more of the Viltrumites showing up now in season 2. 3 Viltrumites show up. They actually attack Alan in pretty brutal scene. We actually see Alan get the shit kicked out of him. Like, he basically gets disemboweled. His eyeball gets knocked out of his head. His arm gets ripped off. It's just like, I'm just like watching it. I'm like, oh my God. Like I hated that scene with Alan's character that we actually see that happen to him. Spoiler alert, just because I know this from the comics. I mean, I know what happens with Alan later, so I know he's not really dead, but still, I mean, that whole scenario with him, yeah, that was pretty brutal to watch. And especially since you see like his girlfriend in the background watching everything, like her reaction too is, you know, it's pretty heartbreaking watching her have to see him getting tortured by these 3 sadistic Viltrumites. It also is a good scene because I think it really showcases just how strong they are. Because we see Alan in season 1, he goes toe-to-toe with Mark, and they seem relatively evenly matched, even though I don't think they were necessarily fighting like at their peak or at full strength at least. But this definitely shows like he just seems completely helpless against them. Of course, they also say that like when they go into his background story, they do say that he was biogenetically engineered to fight Viltrumites, even though they pretty much admit that he never stood a chance against them. Also, kind of a funny tidbit, I like how when they're showing the backstory of Alan and when they show like the Unopans, his people, when they show like when they were trying to breed to create the Ultimate Warrior, I like how they show all the different test subjects, or I guess I should say the different end results. How some of them have extra limbs, and then one of them that they consider, you know, a reject actually has 2 eyes instead of 1. I don't know. I thought that was funny. I like that little tidbit of comedy that they threw in there. But yeah, like that ends on a pretty dark note with Alan's character. And then of course, also again, spoiler alert, the mole is actually Thetis, or at least he appears to be, because he's on life support in the hospital, the space hospital, I guess. And then Thetis shows up and actually pulls the plug on him, you know. He seems conflicted about it because he actually says, you know, forgive me, Alan, so not sure where that's leading. I mean, I know a little bit about Thetis from the comics, but not a whole lot, so I don't really know what his motivations are. I think, if I remember correctly, I do believe he is a Viltrumite, if I'm not mistaken, like one of the oldest ones, but I could be wrong about that. But that's interesting. It's also kind of interesting seeing Peter Cullen voice a villain, or at least an antagonist, so curious to hear more about what he says. I will say this, hearing Peter Cullen, don't get me wrong, his voice is awesome, but like when he delivers his lines in the show, I just keep hearing Optimus Prime, and I just keep expecting him to say something like Autobots roll out or something. So it's not that his voice doesn't fit Thetis, but it's just like, I can't not hear Optimus Prime. Every time I hear that voice coming out of Thetis' mouth, I'm just like, that's Optimus. But yeah, all the stuff with Alan, I like his stuff. I like his part with his girlfriend. Also, kind of a funny little part in this episode is I like how they show Mark when he's in college, him and Amber are in their dorm and they're, you know, getting intimate. And then it cuts away from that to Alan, who him and his girlfriend start, you know, getting intimate in their apartment. And so like, and even the narrator's like, oh, okay, well, let's go from Alan back to Mark. Oh, okay, nope. Okay, let's just go to Alan's pet. Let's just see what he's doing. Like, I like that the show actually took the time to introduce that little awkward moment where it doesn't want to show the audience like what's going on between these two couples. On that note, though, and I think I talked about this when I talked about episodes 1 and 2, we see Mark and Amber actually spend more time together in this episode and get to be more of like an actual normal couple. Like when they're in her dorm and they're kind of hanging out and they start going at it. It's a nice, sweet moment where we get to see Mark finally have kind of a somewhat normal relationship with a human being and not focus so much on being a superhero. And again, I talked about this in the last episodes that I reviewed. That's a big thing that I think season 2 is kind of getting into, is just the psychological effects of not just being a superhero, but even being around a superhero, being related to one, or just having one in your life, and just the sometimes I guess the unspoken or unseen impacts that can have on a person. So it's nice in this scene, like you root for Mark. Like I found myself rooting for Mark, and like in this scene, I'm just kind of like yeah, good for him. Like he finally gets to enjoy something for once, because Lord knows the kid just can't get a break. So I like that moment. And again, I like Amber's character a lot more in season 2. She seems a lot more grounded. She seems a lot more in Mark's corner. I like that she kind of, she's encouraging him. She's backing him. And I like her character in general a lot more in season 2. So all the stuff with those two, I think, is very sweet. I think it really helps keep Mark grounded and, gives the audience kind of a nice quiet moment to, I guess, to decompress from like the heavier action scenes that occur throughout the season. We get to see more of Duplicate and Rex. There's a confrontation between them where Rex kind of confronts her about her relationship with Immortal. What I like about this scene is I like how Duplicate, we get to see more of her character, because really I feel like in season 1 we don't get a whole lot about her other than seeing her powers in action, the fact that she can make copies of herself or clones. But it's like it's implied that she can feel all of her clones' pain. So like whenever they die, she experiences it, which is pretty messed up when you think about it, because she's died like hundreds of times. And the reason I bring that up is because that comes into the conversation she has with Rex, where like at first he's kind of grossed out with her about her relationship with Immortal because he doesn't get it. But she basically tells him that because of, if you add up all the times that she's, duplicated herself and died, she's probably about the same age as him, give or take. Which is like, yeah, when you think about it, that does kind of make sense. It's an interesting perspective, but it definitely kind of makes sense. And like I said, it adds this layer to her character that I feel like wasn't there before. And it wasn't necessary, but I still liked it. And again, it does kind of make her relationship with the Immortal make sense. I think one of the criticisms I had in my last episode was that their relationship kind of felt like it came out of nowhere. Here, it kind of feels like they give a little bit more context to it in terms of like how it came about. So I appreciate that. And I like that they took the time to do that. And one thing I just kind of want to stress is like, I didn't have a problem with their relationship. I just kind of wished, I guess in the previous episode, that they had, I guess, elaborated on it a little bit more, or maybe dropped more hints about it. It just kind of felt like it came out of nowhere. But at least here we get a little bit of context behind it. So that I think really worked. And also too, Rex in general is just a funny character. I like that whole thing with him. He's such a douchebag. And also, I like how they're in the training room, and I love when Shapeshift comes in there and just starts running on the treadmill backwards, and he's just awkwardly kind of power walking, I guess. His character, I swear, he kills me. Every scene he's in, he's just so funny. There's also kind of a sweet moment between Rudy, aka Robot, and Monster Girl, where they go out to the movie theaters. I mean, I'll be honest, I thought this was probably the weaker part of the episode. Don't get me wrong. I like Robot. I like Monster Girl. I'm very curious to see more of Robot, because I kind of know a little bit about him from the comics and kind of some of the things that he does. So I'm curious to see more of his character. But I will say, for me personally, this was probably not I don't want to say this part of the episode was bad, but it was definitely, for me, the least interesting. I just didn't really care about it. Like, I like these two characters. I like that we're getting to see more of them together, getting to see them kind of get to know each other better and building a relationship. But for me, I just wasn't as invested. So probably the one part of the episode where I was probably the least interested in what was going on. One part of the episode that I really liked was with Debbie's character, which was something that I was not expecting. I was kind of expecting the biggest parts for me to be with Alan and Mark, or at least the parts that I was most invested in. And don't get me wrong, I was. But I really like the stuff with Debbie. In particular, there's a part where she goes to the support group for people who are like spouses or partners, former partners of superheroes. I think it's like surviving partners of like dead superheroes, essentially. And she meets this guy there who was either the boyfriend or the husband of Green Ghost from season 1, one of the members of the Guardians of the Globe. I almost said Guardians of the Galaxy. And she was killed by Omni-Man, if you remember that from season 1. And just that whole conversation where Debbie's talking to this guy and they're in the bar and she finally realizes who he is and just his relationship with Green Ghost, and everything that Nolan did comes flashing back to her. And it leads to this really awkward and really painful confrontation between her and him, where she explains who she is and he basically tells her not to come back and kind of sort of threatens her in a way. it's it's a really good scene, really well done. Again, Sandra Oh, I think is really good as Debbie. I think she plays that part very well. Her performance does not feel phoned in at all. Like every emotional beat that she hits, I think she hits pretty much perfectly. And like I said, this scene I think really helps hammer home the idea that like these feel like real characters who are being impacted by these events that happen to them. And I really appreciate the writers and the voice actors for having moments like this. These really awkward, tough moments, these conversations that I always feel like probably happen behind the scenes in movies like The Avengers and Spider-Man, but you don't really see them. It's like real people are affected by these superheroes, and that's the part of superhero stories that I feel like you don't get to see very often. So everything having to do with that, I really like. Um, I also like near the end of the episode, we get where Mark, one of his toys, Seance Dog, appears to come to life, and it leads to this really funny fight where they're having this battle in midair. I will have to say though, it's in the middle of the night, and I like how even though it shows like there's students walking around just beneath them, like 30, 40 feet below them, and Seance Dog is glowing. I love how nobody notices. Nobody says anything. But I like that little confrontation. It's very brief, but it's pretty comical. And then, of course, Seance Dog reveals that he's actually an alien kind of bug thing called a Thraxan, who's actually been sent there to find Mark to take him back to his home planet because he tells him like his planet's being threatened by asteroids. The whole conversation between them is like really funny. I just like that whole thing. It also leads to another sweet moment where Mark does agree to go to the bug's planet to help him out. And then he actually calls Amber and tells her that he loves her, even though his phone cuts out. But I don't know. I like that. That was a really sweet moment because I feel like we don't really get a whole lot of intimate moments between him and Amber. So I think for him to finally admit his feelings to her, again, even though she didn't hear it, I really liked that aspect of it. So I liked that. Again, everything with Mark and Amber in this season I think is really well done. I really enjoy that. And then, of course, the episode ends on a really big cliffhanger. He finally gets to Thraxia, where he finds out that the asteroids or the meteors that are destroying the planet are actually not real. It's just a load of crap. And the truth is, like, the bug that was sent to get him was actually sent by their emperor, who is actually Nolan, Mark's father. And the episode literally ends with Nolan reintroducing himself to his son and basically says, hello, son, it's been a while. And pretty much ends right there. What a cliffhanger. Like, what a way to end an episode. The entire episode I thought was really well done. Again, like I said, I love the switch up with Alan's character that he actually gets the title card. I like that. It kind of gives this character that didn't get a whole lot of screen time in the first season more time in this one. I'm just curious to see like if he's going to come back for the rest of season 2, and if he does, like what his part will be, how big of a part he'll have in the rest of the season. Again, I kind of know what happens with him in the comic. I just don't know. I don't know how that's going to translate into the show. But that stuff's really good. Again, I like the stuff with Mark and Amber. I like seeing them get to be more of a traditional couple. That's really nice. A lot of sweet moments there. And also, of course, Nolan coming back into the show. I love Nolan's character. He's such a great, deep character. And I can't wait to talk more about him in the next episode, which I'm going to get to here momentarily. So, episode 4 of season 2 of Invincible is, I personally think it might be the best episode in the entire show so far. At the very least, it's the best episode of season 2 thus far. I'm still waiting for, the second half of season 2, but I think this was definitely my favorite. First of all, like I said, anything with Nolan and J.K. Simmons, who I think is just a phenomenal voice actor, I think he's great. Every scene that he's in is fantastic. Him and Mark are definitely the focal point of this episode, and I think that definitely works to the episode's credit. But one thing I love about this episode is we get to see in a great flashback what Nolan was doing when he left Earth at the end of season 1. And we see him flying through space in a really great montage where we get to see him basically like the emotional torment that he went through just completely. It's clear that he was a broken man. You can just see it in his face. Like he's a man that just, he doesn't know what to do with himself. He doesn't know what the future holds for him, or he even wants a future. And what I really like about it is that there's a scene later in the episode where it's a great comparison where Debbie kind of goes through the same thing. Like we see her wandering the streets of the city, again, just completely drowning in her own depression, just like Nolan when he's flying through space. And it leads to a really powerful moment with these two characters where Nolan actually is contemplating suicide, and he actually decides to go through with it. There's a scene where he's basically floating in front of a black hole, and he actually decides to throw himself into it, but stops at the very last second because he sees this strange ship coming from out of nowhere about to get sucked into and decides to save it, which that ship, of course, belongs to a bunch of Thraxans, which is that same planet that he was on at the end of episode 3, where we see Mark show up. And like they decide to make him their emperor, essentially, because he saved their lives. But we see a similar scene with Debbie where she's standing over on an overpass of a highway, and it looks like she's about to, kind of like what Nolan did with the black hole, she's about to throw herself in, she's about to throw herself over and kill herself, but she doesn't do it. What I really love about this is this shows the different strengths of character these two people have. Nolan is obviously physically way stronger than Debbie, or really anybody else on Earth for that matter. But emotionally, it seems like Debbie is definitely the stronger of the two, because Nolan decides to end everything, but Debbie doesn't. So it shows that, like, even though she's been broken, even though her entire life has just been torn apart, she still is willing to tough it out and keep going, whereas Nolan decides he can't do it anymore. Like, he's a man who really has nowhere to go. He's betrayed the Viltrumite Empire. He knows that they're probably going to come for him, but he can't go back to Earth because his family and nobody there wants him anymore, so he has nowhere to go. And he just decides to end it all. It's such a powerful moment between, like, kind of showcasing just how different these two characters are, just on a fundamental emotional level. Like, one being physically stronger than the other, but emotionally weaker, and the other one being physically weaker than the other, but emotionally stronger. It's great writing right there, and there's no dialogue whatsoever, but I think it conveys the message very clearly and effectively. Great moment in the episode. If nothing else, those two scenes by themselves, I think, make the episode so great. But we get to see that, and then, of course, it leads to, finally coming back to where we see Mark, and he finally has kind of a brief confrontation with his father. And I will say, I looked up this scene in the comic, and they do it a little bit differently in the show. In the comic, when Mark goes up to Nolan, he breaks down and starts crying and hugs him and begs him to come back to Earth. But in the show, Mark actually gets in Nolan's face and even kind of gets a little bit defiant and acts like he might punch him for a split second. And you can tell Nolan is expecting the punch because he actually readies himself for it. But Mark does still hug him, but again, he still seems angry about it, which I thought was... I don't know if I agree with that change. I almost kind of feel like it works a little bit better in the comic, the fact that Mark breaks down and cries. Like, don't get me wrong, his anger in the show is 100% justified, and I totally get it, but it makes the hug feel a little out of nowhere. I don't know. I think it would have been better if they were going to go down with the route of him being angry at Nolan. I think it would have made more sense for Mark to either hit him or not hug him, but instead just yell at him. So I don't know if the hug works in the show, just considering how they decided to make Mark respond emotionally to his father. I don't know. Some of you may disagree with me on that, but I just kind of thought either go with what the comic did or don't go with the hug if you're going to have Mark be angry with him. So for me personally, I kind of thought that scene kind of mixed messages there. But regardless, it's still a powerful scene and it still works. And then we get to kind of hear Nolan's explanation to Mark that the reason he called him there is because there's a bunch of Viltrumites coming to essentially kill Nolan for abandoning his post on Earth, which those are the same three Viltrumites that we saw take out Alan in the previous episode. So now we kind of understand like why those Viltrumites are there, why they're coming. Because in the previous episode, we did see that they questioned Alan and asked them about Nolan, but of course Alan didn't tell them anything. So now we kind of see like, okay, Nolan is expecting them and he's asking Mark to help him fight against them. Which one thing I like too in this scene is I like how, because the first thing that I thought was, well, if Mark could barely handle you, how is he going to help you fight 3 other Viltrumites? Which of course Mark actually asks him that same question. So I like how they make Mark intelligent enough to kind of realize like, well, hang on, dude, I might have gotten a little bit stronger here, but you kind of knocked the crap out of me in the last episode or the last season. So, and I like I like that whole confrontation between them. We get to see Nolan introduces us to his wife on Thraxia, who is played by, I can't remember her name. She's Kim Wexler from Better Call Saul. As I recognize her voice, I can't remember her name. Is it Rhea Seahorn? I think that's her name. but she voices her. She voices Nolan's Thraxian wife, which that whole scene was really funny. Their little makeout session was like so gross. The way they like go at it with their tongues, I was just like, oh god. And then of course we're introduced to Mark's half brother Oliver. So like that Nolan had with his wife. I can't remember her character's name in the show, but I love Mark's reaction to that, and I love how they cut him off too. Like they use the Invincible title card, but he doesn't actually say Invincible. I love how he's just like, you have got to be kidding me. Like that scene made me chuckle. I also, one thing I've noticed about Nolan's character in this episode is that it seems like he is more like he's regretful about what happened on Earth. And I like when Mark kind of confronts him about it too. Like he even tells him, like you could have said sorry, and he's like, after everything you did to me, like, how can I forgive you? Basically, he kind of says something to that effect. I like how he even tries to leave at first, and then Nolan tries to stop him. And again, kind of in a funny moment, he's like, Earth's millions of miles away, Mark, and you don't know where you're going. Like navigation was never your strong suit. It's just like, he's kind of got a point, Mark. Maybe listen to him. But yeah, that whole scene is fantastic. I also like how they kind of explain, like, even though the Thraxians age way faster than humans, like I think it's like they only live for like a year in human time. Like Nolan's DNA is like making his son age slower, even though he's like half Viltrumite, half Thraxian. Like he's aging slower, and he's basically like a blue human being. So that's kind of interesting too. I don't know. I try not to think about that stuff too much because it's kind of weird and kind of gross. But that whole scene is funny. I like how it's kind of done for comic effect, but it's also kind of a big moment too. And I like the conflict that Mark's going through as well. Like, as you can tell, like he does care about he cares about the Thraxans. He doesn't want to see anything bad happen to them. And he's also clearly still pissed off at his father for what he did to him in season 1, which is completely understandable. But I also like how, he wants to protect them as well, but I kind of get the feeling that he's also kind of scared because he still remembers what happened to him in season 1 when he fought his father. So like knowing that there's 3 more Viltrumites coming, each of which could be at least as strong as Omni-Man, if not stronger, definitely, probably not giving Mark a whole lot of confidence in that respect. And they do arrive pretty quickly. They pretty much arrive right after their conversation. So Mark really doesn't get a lot of time to really prepare for them. There's another scene kind of cutting away from that a little bit. There's a great scene with the Muller twins where we kind of cut away back to Earth. And again, the Muller twins, freaking love them. Every scene they're in, I think, is just fantastic. I like how in this scene with them, we see they finally figure out who the original is, or at least the original in respect to these two, because the original is the guy who's still kind of half burned. And I like how, at least in this scene, we actually see that they finally know who the original is for the first time in these 2 seasons. So I like that aspect. I think that part's really funny. Again, everything with the Muller twins, I'm always on board for. I love those 2 characters. I think they're great. There's also more of Donald's character. We get to see more of him finding out the truth about his death from the first season, as well as the fact that he might be a clone, or at the very least, it's implied that he's a clone. His story, I think, coupled with the Muller twins, is definitely an interesting juxtaposition, because with the Muller twins, you got the 2 of them together. But with Donald, you really only got one Donald. So like there's not, I don't know if maybe Cecil's got a bunch of other versions of him in the basement, but at least for now, we only get to see one Donald wandering around. So for him, I imagine that's got to be driving him crazy. It also seems like he might be some kind of superhuman in a sense, because there's a part where, in a pretty gruesome scene, he tries to stab himself with a knife, and even though he breaks the skin, the tip of the knife is like broken, or at least bent. So it's like, is he kind of like a superhuman or something? I'm really interested to see like where they go with that. We don't get a whole lot more with his character in this episode, so I'm assuming that they're probably saving that for the second half of season 2. It's too bad because it really is interesting, but I guess that's kind of on purpose. We get to see more of Adam Eve, who is kind of becoming more of a vigilante in this episode. Like she seems lost throughout the episode. Like it almost kind of seems like she's still trying to be a superhero, but she doesn't really quite know what she's doing. Like there's a scene where she's fighting, is it Kill Cannon? And they're fighting up on a bridge, but even though she takes him out, like it also, she inadvertently puts other people in danger and has to save them. And it's kind of left up in the air as far as like these people that fall into this river, if she actually is able to save their lives. So we get to see more of her character kind of breaking down and sort of like, I guess, the effects of like being alone and living in the forest, but also still trying to balance that with being a superhero, like the effect that that's having on her life. So again, it doesn't go into too much more detail after that, but I'm really curious to see like where that's going to play into the second half of this season. I assume there's going to be more coming from that, so I'll be curious to see like what they do with that. We go back to Thraxia, and we get to see the other Viltrumites do arrive and basically just start just annihilating the Thraxians, or Thraxans, whatever they're called, however you say that word. This leads to a quick confrontation between Mark and one of the Viltrumites called Lucan, I think was his name, who's voiced by Phil Lamar, guy who played Samurai Jack, freaking great voice actor. This scene is really cool because we finally get to see Mark going up against a Viltrumite who isn't just Omni-Man. Again, like I said with episode 3, it's cool to see other Viltrumites finally being thrown into the mix. This is the first time we've really seen them, except for when Alan was around, or in Alan's episode, this is the first time we really see other Viltrumites kind of in the fray. And even though Mark gets a few hits in, he pretty much gets quickly overwhelmed, and then Nolan has to step in and save him. But it's still a pretty brutal fight. The way Nolan just disembowels Lucan, I was just like, oh my god. And then just impales him with like a sharp rock from somewhere in the cave. It's like, God, man, they're not messing around. Also, just kind of a little side note, I love how Lucan quickly overpowers Mark. I love how he just pins Mark to the ground just using his index finger. Like, to me, it really illustrates just how freaking strong these guys are. Like, he's not just pinning him down, he's actually busting Mark's head through the ground, this is like a stone cave, I would assume. Or it looks like it even has crystals. So it's like, I don't know, it just kind of gives you an idea of just how powerful these freaking guys are. So I don't know, it's probably a minor detail, but I really appreciated that. And it also kind of shows like just the level of xenophobia that the Viltrumites have. Like they think that they're better than everybody else. They consider themselves the superiors to every other race in the galaxy. Like, because when Lucan first shows up, he even says like, he remarks about how Nolan had a son with an Earth woman. And he almost kind of seems to say with sort of like a sense of disregard, like almost like he's disgusted by it. So I think it kind of showcases just how superior the Viltrumites view themselves in terms of every other race in the galaxy. And even when he sees that Nolan had Oliver with his wife on Thraxia, Lucan seems even more disgusted by it. He even says it. He says like Nolan had another kid with these disgusting creatures. Like it seems like the Viltrumites all seem to have that same kind of mindset. Like, we're better than everybody else because we're the strongest. And anybody who's beneath us is nothing more than just, meat shields, basically. It also seems to showcase that, like, Nolan, because these are Viltrumite soldiers, and Nolan seems to take out Lucan relatively easily. So I'm guessing that maybe Nolan might be a step above than most Viltrumite soldiers. Lucan does say the great Nolan, so maybe, I don't know, maybe Nolan is supposed to be way stronger. I don't really know how he stacks up against other Viltrumites. To Mark's credit, he gets a few good hits in before he gets his ass stomped. So, and this leads to one of the best scenes, I think, in the episode, and if not in the season, where Mark and Nolan fly out to the city and they see all the other Thraxans are basically just decimated by the remaining 2 Viltrumites. And I like how in this scene we get to see the conflict in Nolan. Like, he clearly feels horrible for these people because he's gotten to know them for the amount of time that he's been there. And he does care about them, again, just like how he cared about the people on Earth. But in this moment, he actually kind of lashes out at Mark and even grabs him by the throat and even demands to know, like, why is it okay to feel like this? Because he even asks, like, how is this better? These are, like, he remarks that the Thraxans are a weak species, and then Mark, gives a great response, which I think is very in keeping with his character. He says that doesn't mean they deserve to die. It's these two ideologies that are kind of going at each other that I think really help hammer home one of the main themes of the show, which in my mind is you have this character Nolan who was raised with this race of people who believe might makes right. If you're strong, you can make the rules. And anybody else, if you're weak, you can't, basically. Whereas Mark grew up on Earth and grew up with the mindset of he wants to be a traditional hero. Like, he's very much like Spider-Man in that sense. He has a very strong sense of justice, Whereas Nolan, despite clearly being conflicted about it, still feels this sense of duty towards his people, towards the Viltrum Empire. And I feel like it all comes to a head in this scene. Like, we see it in Nolan's face. We see the pain of like hundreds, if not thousands of years of having the Viltrumite ideology ingrained in your mind and having it questioned in this one scene. And in many ways, him grabbing Mark by the throat is pretty appropriate because in a lot of ways, Mark is the reason that Nolan feels this way. Mark is the person that quite literally fought against Nolan. He kind of represents the personification of Nolan's internal fight, his refusal to disobey the Viltrumite Empire, but also his willingness to at least consider another way. I think it is really well emphasized in this scene. And just everything about it, the music, the way, the look of just confusion and hurt, and also hatred, the mix of emotions on Nolan's face, it all comes to a head, and then the two other Viltrumites show up, and it leads to this really great, pretty brief, but really great, and also very brutal fight scene between him and Mark and the two remaining Viltrumite soldiers. And I like how in this scene, I love how Nolan actually sticks up for the Thraxans. He even threatens to kill the Viltrumites for what they did to them, which I think is a huge turning point for his character. Because I feel like Nolan, at least in the beginning of season 1, that Nolan would not have done this. There is no doubt in my mind that if those 3 Viltrumites had showed up like at the beginning of the first season, it would have been the end of Earth. Nolan would have joined them in a heartbeat, and he would not have stuck up for the Earthlings. So I think the fact that he's sticking up for the Thraxans, I think shows just how much his character has grown in just a short amount of time. I really do think that Nolan is one of the best characters in this show. Like, again, he's played pitch perfect by J.K. Simmons. I really love his character. He's such an interesting, layered anti-hero. Like, and this scene, I think, really is one of his best moments in the show. Like, watching him fight against the other Viltrumites, and again, it's kind of the inverse of when he fought Mark at the end of season 1. He's fighting Mark at the end of season 1, and Mark kind of represents, he's the personification of everything that Nolan is trying to convince himself he doesn't believe, that the Viltrumite Empire is wrong and that other species besides them have a right to live. Now in this episode, he's being fought with the opposite of that. The Viltrumite ideology is being thrown back in his face, quite literally, in fact. And his fight with, I can't remember the name of the Viltrumite soldier that he fights. Vidor, I think that's his name. Like, that fight is awesome. They seem relatively evenly matched, even though Nolan appears to have a slight edge over him, at least in terms of pure power. Whereas Mark is just getting the shit kicked out of him by Thula, the other Viltrumite, who I recognized her voice. I think that's the voice actress that played Mandy from Billy and Mandy, as well as Azula from Avatar: The Last Airbender, if I'm not mistaken. Grey Griffin, I think is her name. So yeah, her character is awesome. I like how she has that ponytail, and at the end of it, that has like a blade on it. So it's interesting how she uses that in combat when she's fighting Mark. How she uses her ponytail to choke him, but also the blade to cut him too at the same time. It's an interesting combat technique that I feel like you don't see a lot of the other Viltrumites use. It seems like the other ones, like Lucan and Vidor and stuff, they all just kind of use their fists to smash everything, but she actually seems to fight with more grace and finesse. So it's cool to see that, and I think it's interesting to see that kind of character going up against Mark. I also like how Mark is just getting his ass kicked, and Nolan kind of calls him out on it. Like, he's like, Mark, what are you doing? She's killing you out there. And Mark's just like, yeah, I know. Like, I love that little moment. But we do get to see, like, Nolan kind of gives Mark a little pep talk, and then Mark finally gets back up and then kind of lays down the ass beating on Thula's character, which is great. And for me, I was kind of rooting for him just because I was like, yeah, I paid them back for what they did to Alan, because I like Alan's character. I hated what they did to him. So, and I like how the fight scene between them, they actually copied that scene from the comic pretty closely. I think the only difference is the Viltrumites they fight in that scene is different from the ones in the comic. I don't remember who they fight there, but I think it is different than what's in this episode. But man, the way Nolan takes out Vidor, like when he smashes his head, and you actually see his head start to kind of split a little bit, I was like, God, jeez, this show. I forget how mature this show is with the gore. I just saw that. I was just like, oh my God, Nolan, take it easy, dude. Like, okay, he's dead. Calm down. And then again, the way Nolan takes out Thula right before she can kill Mark, like he just smashes her jaw open. I'm just like, man, Nolan's a freaking beast. even amongst Viltrumites, the dude just freaking lays down corpses like nobody's business. And then I like how, I know this is supposed to be a serious moment in the episode, but I like how Luke actually kind of gets the drop on Nolan and actually smashes his back right before he dies too. Like, it is supposed to be the serious moment, and it is for the most part, but I did find it kind of funny in a sense. But again, the episode, that whole fight scene was great. Definitely brutal, the same kind of gore you come to expect from Invincible. And then it leads to the ending of the episode where we actually get introduced to, I think, a fairly big villain from the comics, General Krieg, who is voiced in this by Clancy Brown. Glad to see him back in the show playing another character. He played Damien Darkblood. He plays Krieg, I think, very well. It's a very short scene with his character, but it very effectively, I think, sets up what's to come in later episodes and I think later seasons. They take Nolan away and basically tell Mark that he's going to be executed, and then Krieg tells Invincible, like, now he's in charge and he has to go get Earth ready for the Viltrumite takeover, and that they'll be checking on him, shortly. So it definitely sets up for some pretty big confrontation in later on in this season and also for future seasons. It's a really great moment in the episode. And also too, like, it kind of sets up for, like, I guess more pieces of a puzzle to be solved, because Nolan tells Mark right before he's taken away to find his books on Earth so that he can read them and read about his previous exploits, or previous adventures. So I'm guessing there's more there about Nolan's past that we're going to get. I'm kind of wondering if maybe we're going to get like a flashback possibly in the next half of this season. I'm not sure. I'm going to be interested to see like where this goes. But yeah, for me, this episode 4 of season 2, at least so far, is probably, at least in my mind, one of the best, if not the best, in the entire show. Like, not just this season, but I think in all of the Invincible show, which I realize it hasn't been on too long, but still, it's a great episode, a very strong mid-season finale, and it definitely has me super excited for what's to come next. All right, everybody, I think that's going to conclude this episode. Once again, I am on Anchor, Spotify, and YouTube. If you like what you heard, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time. Later.